If you haven't noticed already, there's been a wave of ancient alien and Anunnaki believers that are attempting to discredit the Hebrew account written in the book of Genesis. Some have gone as far as saying that Adam and Eve were created as slaves for the enrichment of the gods. But is this true? Well, the truth is, the Sumerian mythologies were modified over time by the Akkadians, the Babylonians, and the Assyrians. But by who specifically? Who would have the most to gain in modifying the older versions of the same stories? Well, to address these questions and more, join us in this eye-opening message entitled Creating Man, the how, the who, and the why. And together, let's take an honest look and compare all the epics, starting from the oldest to the youngest, to see how they were changed over time.
Thank you for watching I Believe X.
All right, welcome to I Believe X. This is part 9 of a mini-part series. Last week, we talked about the creation of man. We got into how man was created. We're going to continue in that vein, and we're going to get into the how, why, and who created man. This week's message can be divided into 4 sections: the how, which are the clay contradictions; the who, which are the council contradictions; and the why, which are the caring / clone and curse contradictions. It's going to get interesting. And then, of course, last but not least, we have a section entitled, a bonus section called culture contradictions. Okay, so let's start with the how. Do a quick review from what we learned last week. Last week we learned that the oldest tablet, the Sumerian tablet, which was written or dated at least to 2600 BC, possibly as early as 3500 BC, just 500 years after Adam was created. We found out that the method was using clay, which is similar to the dust of the ground, and the abzu, which are spiritual waters, similar to spiritual waters or the flow of the Spirit, biblically speaking, or the Spirit that was upon the waters we saw in Genesis 1. It is the closest to the Genesis account, which we also believe is also an ancient Sumerian account and predates the Akkadians, the Babylonians, and the Assyrians. Now, this same account was later changed, fashioned, and minimized. A lot of it was removed in the Genesis, and then, of course, it takes kind of a dark turn with the Atrahasis. We found out that they changed the story. It's no longer from the Abzu, which are the spiritual waters that were used to create all things, according to Peter. The heavens and the earth were created by water and for water, and these spiritual waters also created everything in the Enuma Elish as well. Well, anyways, instead of it just being these spiritual waters, it was modified by 1800 BC, which is the time of Old Babylon during Hammurabi, okay? And it became clay plus the spirit, flesh, and blood of another being, a god, called Awilla. And then, of course, that's Akkadian for a being. And then, of course, man becomes Awillam, which is human created from a god, from the spirit of a god. His spirit remained. Now, there's more to that story. I just want to point out that the creation of man, the method, over the Babylonian sources, the Sumerians are the closest to what the Bible has to say, the oldest versions, and then we see they're modified later. It becomes the clay plus the spirit of another god. And then, of course, in the Enuma Elish, it's no longer clay plus Awilla, but they actually changed the being. Now it's clay plus Kingu, which is an enemy god, no longer a god among them, one of their own, but then an enemy god. So there are clay contradictions. We see contradictions, and our conclusion is that the last two, the Old Babylonian and the New Babylonian versions of how man were created, are definitely frauds, were definitely modified over time. And we found out that the oldest versions, which are the Sumerian versions, which are closest to when man were created, is the most similar to what the Bible actually has to say. We can get behind those. Those aren't too far off. Okay, those were our conclusions. Now let's get into the who. Let's talk about the council contradictions. The council also changes over time, and it begins to contradict the earlier versions as well. Enki and Ninmah, it's Enki and Nintu, they fashion. Then by the time we get to 2,000 years after Adam, to the Genesis period where the Akkadians are ruling in the region, then we get An, Enlil, Enki, and Nintu. Okay. Then by the time we get to the the Old Babylonian kingdom, the Atrahasis, which is also Akkadian, written in Akkadian language, which is a Babylonian language, we get Enlil, Enki, Nintu fashion, and An is completely removed. Then by the time we get down to New Babylon period, or in the region, it's only Marduk. Okay, and ironically, Marduk becomes the hero and responsible for everything. Marduk's name's on everything. Marduk's in control. Marduk's in power. Marduk did everything. Marduk's the one that did it. And then now all we hear about is Marduk and Enki when it comes to the creating of man. They're the only council that are really responsible. They did say, let's convene the Great Assembly, but it's all Marduk's idea. Enki fashions it, his dad, and now it's father and son only, and they're getting credit for it. Obviously, you would see this because Marduk was the patron god of Babylon. So we would expect this. And of course, then he becomes the hero of the old stories. No longer is An mentioned. No longer is Enlil mentioned in the Enuma Elish. Marduk in the Enuma Elish, he says, I will create human beings. And of course, Enki seconds the plan. Then Marduk says, commands the great gods to convene an assembly. He's the one in control. He's the one in power. The story completely changes for Babylon to suit the patron god of Babylon. And then not only does the council change, but also the method also changes. Now they're using the blood of Kingu, which is completely contradictory to what the Atrahasis and the earlier versions say completely. Okay, so we can recognize what the fraud is. Now, I want you to note this. From the time Adam was created all the way almost 3,400 years, even past the times of the Atrahasis or Old Babylonian Kingdom, the only gods, the only council that's mentioned is An, Enlil, Enki, and Nintu. Even in the Atrahasis, which is Old Babylon, Marduk is never mentioned. He's not mentioned then either. Okay, Marduk is mentioned 3,400 years, and out of nowhere, all of the old stories are modified, and it's no longer An, Enlil, Enki, and Nintu. It's no longer them that are responsible for the creation of man. It's now Marduk is all responsible for it. Okay, so our conclusion is that the Enuma Elish is definitely fraud. We definitely know that Marduk, who Marduk is. If you want to know more about him, check out our message called "Solving the Mystery of Marduk." Okay, so we believe that this also is a fraud as well. Now, let's talk about the why. The carrying contradictions, okay? And this is going to be the majority of the meat of what this message is actually about. We're going to get into the why. All right, the Enki and Ninmah, which are the oldest versions, dated to 2600 BC, it's carrying baskets for the growth, abundant growth of the food provision, okay, in the region. Then by the time we get to Eridu-Genesis, 600 years later, actually 600 years after the flood, it becomes carrying baskets, and then of course now it's about dredging clay, even though man was initially called in the Enki and the Sumerian sources to just carry baskets, okay? Then it becomes dredging clay, and then by the time we get to the Atrahasis, okay, which is almost 2,200 years after man's created, during the times of Old Babylon, okay, the Akkadian sources, then all of a sudden man is he's a clone, and he was cursed as a slave, and we're going to get into the details of that. I mean, it takes an extremely dark turn. Okay, and then it takes an even darker turn. Okay, in the Enuma Elish, it says that man was created for the toil of the gods. That's their purpose, to serve the gods for toil. And this deed, it says, is beyond comprehension. Okay, so let's get into it. Let's start with the Enki and Ninmah, since from last week we believe that it's probably the closest to the Bible, and we're using that as our cornerstone to compare the other Babylonian epics because it comes from the same region and the same group of people. Okay, the Enki and Ninmah, it says that man was created as a substitute for the minor gods so they can be freed from their toil. Eridu-Genesis talks about a period afterwards, so we can't really compare that one. The Atrahasis says the drudgery of the minor gods. Okay. The Enuma Elish says to bear the gods' toil so they can rest. Now, at face value, this looks like it's the same, but it's not. The Atrahasis, the details in the Atrahasis and the Enuma Elish, and they completely add details that are not in the Enki and Ninmah and some of the older Sumerian sources. Let's go on with the Enki and Ninmah. It says, when the gods were obliged to provide or work for their food and for their meals, the gods were digging the canals and piling up the silt in Harali. The gods dredging the clay began complaining about this life. Okay, so it was a community effort, according to Enki and Ninmah. Okay, it was the gods were involved as well. Now, of course, there's division amongst the gods. The senior gods oversaw the work. The minor gods were bearing the toil. Okay, so what we see here is we see management. The senior gods oversaw the work, which was the easy work, and the minor gods, which really are revealed as their sons, were bearing the toil, which were doing the hard work. Okay, the newbies, okay, or the youngest ones who had the strength in their bodies were doing the hard work. Okay, we're not denying there wasn't hard work. Of course there is with digging. Of course, I'll just tell you a little story. When I was a plumber, when I started doing plumbing, I did plumbing work for a year. The first place they put me, of course they always put the newbies on digging, doing the underground work and doing the digging. All the newbies got to do the hard work. But from Enki and Ninmah, you don't get this sense that man was created and destined to serve as slaves, as you kind of see the story changes and you see in some of the other epics. So what they're doing is they're conflating the older Babylonian stories with the earlier Sumerian stories, and then now twisting the purpose for why man was created in some of the earlier stories, the Sumerian stories, but you don't really get the same implications from the earlier stories. I'm going to show you in a few. Okay, so what we see here is the gods, your creatures, are smashing their tools. They're tired of the hard work. They want to be replaced. They want replacement. They want new hires. They need help. They need balance in their life. This is just too much work. They need help. Okay, so what we see here, what I see is more of a union strike. Everybody's doing the work. It's community work. Let's get into it. Let me show you. It becomes clear. It says these cities, which are everybody, had been allotted half-bushel baskets to dredge the canals and carry their water. Okay, somebody's got to manage, somebody's got to oversee, and somebody does have to do the work. It's like that at every company. Okay, there was work assigned. Now, when man was created, it was imposed upon him the work of carrying baskets, but it doesn't say drudgery, it doesn't say toil, it doesn't say dredge the canals, but just the work of carrying baskets. That was the initial work that man was assigned to. Okay, and it doesn't mean that he was assigned as a slave. These are all misconceptions, and these are borrowed from the later Babylonian versions. Okay, and then people are now filtering and seeing and interpreting the stories, the ancient Sumerian sources and stories from the later Babylonian stories, and they're getting the idea that man was created as a slave. He escaped Eden, and we're going to get into that in a few. So the reality of it is that there was a common mission. They were cleaning the canals. Why? For established abundant growth. They had to have waterways. They basically were called and commissioned to water the garden and make sure that the gardens, that everybody had the food and everybody was provided for it and everybody had provision. This is what I am seeing in the Inca and Ninmah stories, the later stories that were later modified by the Babylonians. Okay, so they basically say there's a whole group of people now that are saying that the Gigi were slaves, humans were replacement for slaves, humans were just created as worker slaves, purely workers to enrich the gods, humans escaped from Eden, humans were mistreated. We don't get this from the older stories. This is not where we're getting. Of course, the Gigi, the younger gods, were tired of the hard work and did want to be replaced and did need relief, but that's not a foreshadowing and a projection upon why humans were created, and it doesn't mean that humans were created as slaves because they replaced the hard work that the gods were doing. Okay, we're not getting that, but you do see that in the Atrahasas and the Melishas. We're going to get into in a few. Okay, so the why. Let's look at the Bible, what the Bible has to say. And this is going to give us even more clarity on why man was created, and maybe looking at some of the older Sumerian versions as opposed to the Babylonian versions. And I think when we compare the two and some of the other mythologies, you're going to get a greater picture of how man was really created, why he was really created, and then, of course, how that purpose changed and how they modified the stories because they wanted man's purpose to change for their own gain, as you're going to see in a few. The Bible, of course, says, Genesis 1:28, God blessed man and said to him, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Now, if man was created as a slave, that's not a blessing. Okay, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. How could he increase in number and fill the earth if he was stuck on this slave plantation called the Garden of Eden? So reading the Sumerian epics through filtering it through what the Bible has to say, which is what I do, I still give them a fair look. And I still use them as context for looking at the word. Of course, both are ancient Sumerian sources, but obviously I always look through the filter of the word. I don't read into the word, but I use the word to filter out what some of the older sources say, and that's when the older versions become clear that they were modified. Okay, so because the older Sumerian sources are closest to the Bible in this case as well. Why man was created. Genesis 2 says, now Yahweh Elohim had planted a garden in the east in Eden, and there he put a man he had formed. Okay, so he blesses him, and it says, fill the earth, increase in number. So the question is now, why is he putting him in the garden? If he says, fill the earth, he blessed them and increased them, why is he putting them in the garden? Okay, my opinion on this is that for worker training. And of course, we know biblically he tests them as well. He gives them a test, but also for provision. Okay, to provide for him, to protect him, to give him graciously the work that he's done and the work that the foundation that he's laid to give the man, so man doesn't have to go out and work and try to be somebody and be great and do things on his own and try to learn the hard way, but he can actually benefit from the gracious inheritance that he's being given in the Garden of Eden by Yahweh Elohim. Yahweh Elohim took the man and put the garden to work it. Okay. Oh yeah, to work it. He's a slave. Now they're using those sources, the Atras and the Babylonian sources, to now reinterpret what the word says, but that was not the intentions of Elohim. He is not a monstrous slave master. He is a good father who wanted to train his son and prepare him probably for the world, because he's got to learn how to work and take care of the gardens and the farms so that he can provide for his family and provide for his community and then eventually provide for his nation. Okay, to work it. So let's look at the word work and some of the translations here and just make sure that in the Hebrew it says what it says. Okay, in the garden to work it. Now the word work can apply to different types of work. It can be slave work. It can. Okay, and of course, you know, the Babylonian, Anunnaki, ancient alien, paleo contact, you know, narratives and agendas that make good books want to tell you that Adam was a slave, but he wasn't. Okay, he did work, of course. Yeah, he was a man as a slave, but it also can be the same type of work can be for a servant. Just depends on context. This work also is applied to the work of a soldier. It's also applied to the work of a laborer. It's also applied to the work to cultivate land, of course, and as a tiller of land. Okay, so it is work. He is being called to work. Okay, the Garden of Eden, in the Garden of Eden that was provided for by Yahweh himself, Yahweh Elohim. It says to work it and care for it. Now, 2 notes. It was already planted, verse 9, okay, and it was already watered. Now, to take care of it. Shamar is the Hebrew word. It means to keep, watch, and preserve, to preserve it, to work it and preserve a work that was already done, a work that was already watered, a work that was... God wasn't trying to enslave man. He was trying to teach him, to train him, and raise him up. In addition to that, he was freely allowed to eat from any tree. Okay, this is pre the fall. We'll get into the fall next week. But what I see is agricultural education, farm management, and food provision. This was total provision by the Father in this season of his life. And then of course, it was in this season that he was also given a wife, which means that God had to prepare him to provide for his family and to lead his family and provide for his children. And the best way to do that is take him from out running the streets to give him a job and put him in a place where we can give him some training so he can provide for his family and so he can grow up. That's what I see. Now, people have a problem with this whole work in the Garden of Eden and God is a slave master and this and that because of these other sources. That's just not true. Even the Bible says in the New Testament, for even when we were with you, we gave you this rule. The one who is unwilling to work shall not eat. So you think Yahweh's going to put him in the garden and not put him to work? Are you going to not put your sons to work and raise your sons up and discipline your sons and not put them to work and train them to provide for their families? No. This is what we see. Now, the Enki and Ninmah stories actually agree with this. I believe they do. If you don't try to use the later Babylonian sources to reinterpret Enki and Ninmah, it does. It actually matches up with what the Bible actually has to say. Okay, now let's look at some of the other mythologies, who I believe also, let's look outside of the Bible and the Sumerian sources. Let's see what some of these other mythologies say, okay? The Effect mythology, which is Abasi, is the supreme, this is an African mythology. Abasi is the supreme God and creator of the universe. Abasi created the first humans, man and woman. He allowed them to live with him in his space, the garden he provided, what he created, the work that he did, okay, and provided for their needs. Abasi initially forbade them from inhabiting the earth, probably because they weren't ready yet. His wife Atai convinced him that humans should be allowed to inhabit the earth, okay, but with strict conditions. She's like, oh, I think they're ready. He's like, I'm not sure if they're ready. She's like, oh, I think they're ready. Okay, he says, okay, fine, but these are the rules. They were not to farm or grow their own food. I don't want you going out toiling and working hard and trying to provide for yourself and become great and this and that. You're not ready yet. You still need training. Okay, come back to me. Let me provide for you. I've already made a way. I've already made provision. Why would you go out and work for something I've already done? This is the entire gospel, by the way, grace versus works. Okay, these rules were meant to ensure that humans remain dependent on Abasi for their sustenance and protection, of course. Okay, but I don't need your protection. I don't need what you've provided. I can do it on my own. I can do it on my own. I can see the pride in them right now. I could become great. Of course, that manifests in the Tower of Babel as well. We see later. But despite the rules, humans eventually disobeyed Abasi. We know the story. This is the same story as the Bible. Other mythologies say the same story. And as a result of their disobedience, Abasi introduced death in the world in the form of punishment. He frustrates their pride. Okay, because they're trying to succeed without him. He was the one that created him. He wants them dependent and wants to give to them graciously and freely, but they don't want free. They don't want the grace. They reject his grace. They want to become great. They want to do it on their own, and they want to work for his approval, and they want to show him how great they can be apart from him and how great they can be. They want to be Elohim. They want to be God. This is the same story. Okay, let's go on. What about the other mythologies? Norse, Chinese, African, Europe, Zoroastrian, they all have similar creation stories created from elements which are wood, earth, clay. Some of them are wood, some of them are plant, but still elements of the earth and spirit. Okay, they still have councils, and all of their stories are positive stories. Populate, 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 populate. And then we get down to the Sumerians. Now the older versions also say populate but also serve and work. Okay, and the Hebrew says both. To increase, he blessed them and called them to increase, subdue, and fill the earth. But also then, of course, when the time of season, when man was mature enough, called him to work, to prepare him in the garden to provide for his family. This is what I see. Okay, so what happens later on? Babylon modifies the mythology. So Enki and Ninmah, all of the ancient Sumerian mythologies and stories, which we do now believe that Genesis is that. It's ancient Sumerian. It's not Akkadian and Babylonian. Those stories are modified. But the Bible does agree with the ancient Sumerian stories are the same. Even all the other mythologies are the same. Except for Babylon's, they start modifying. The Akkadians and the Babylonians and Assyrians start modifying these mythologies. For example, let's see where the major shift takes place, which is the Atrahasis in 1800, which is Old Babylon, not New Babylon, where Nebuchadnezzar was in rule. They now tell a different story. They change the story where he is now carrying baskets for growth, abundant growth of the region. Everybody has to do community work. Everybody's serving a common goal. The common goal is everybody has to be providing for each other. Man's now being taught and trained how to work. He starts with carrying baskets. He's got to start somewhere. He's got to start digging underground, doing the plumbing work like I did, and then he'll learn some of the tougher things later on. Okay, so then it goes from that to now the Atrahasas. Man is now destined to slavery as a clone, and they're cursing his destiny. And man was created from a seance / chanting / spiritual ceremony. Let me show you here in a few. And then of course then it becomes the toil of gods, and then the deed is beyond comprehension, which sounds like slavery. Okay, this is why the ancient astronaut theorists and the Anunnaki believers are now believing that that these stories are about slave masters, and the gods were slave masters, and this whole twisted twisted theology about the purpose for man and how I was created, then of course begins to shadow the good heart and the purposes of Yahweh and Yahweh's work through the foreign gods that now, or the gods that were on his council, then become foreign gods he separates himself from, and of course eventually become judged. And the good purposes that Yahweh had intended for man become twisted and modified, and man becomes cursed in these later stories. And I'm going to show you that these later stories are modified by those who gain the most from modifying these stories so that they can use and abuse man. They change the stories and the purposes for why he was created. Let's get into it. Are you ready? The Atrahasa says that they mix the clay in rooms of fate. This is the clay of, they slaughter Awilla, as we previously said. They use his blood and flesh and mix it with clay, and the spirit remains on man, but they use the spirit of another god. Okay, so they're not even using the Abzu, the spiritual pure waters that were upon the waters that were given initially by Yahweh. I personally believe they don't got access to them anyways, because Yahweh separates himself from them, starts a new nation. Okay, now they're beating drums. So what is this? They have so this means they have a spiritual ceremony, and this becomes more magical and then it does spiritual later anyways, and it becomes more wicked sounding than it does actual spiritually sounding. Okay, they're playing drums, so we have like a seance / spiritual ceremony. Okay, they line up womb goddesses. Enki commands Nintu to continue reciting incantations, which are chanting. We're on number 4. Then they take a mud brick to curse man, and they nip off 14 pieces of the clay that was mixed with Awula's spirit. Place 7 on one side, 7 on the other, and they put a mud brick in between to curse man. Okay, sounds like voodoo. A mud brick between the pieces to curse man. Okay, the mixed clay, and then they take, after they curse the clay and curse his destiny, to build and use and create mud bricks to build their palaces and build their temples. These god kings. They take the clay, they insert it into the womb goddesses as a form of magical IVF, in vitro fertilization with the clay mix. Put it in these womb goddesses, and then 10 months later, the womb goddesses are commanded to take that mud brick, okay, and put it next to them for 7 days before they give birth, and then 9 days after they give birth. So what are they doing? They want the womb goddesses to be reminded of why man is being created. We are creating these men, and we are cursing them to build our palaces and to work with mud bricks. We're cursing their destiny. Then 9 days after, now by the way, when the men were born, it says that they had beards on, which means they're giving birth to full-grown men. We do believe that the Elohim, many of them were giants. The Nephilim, their offspring, were also giants. And so when you look at their sizes and some of the seals, it's possible that the women were about a third of their size. Potentially these womb goddesses did give birth to potential full-grown men. So when the man's born, okay, in maturity, the first thing they want him to see for 9 days straight, they want him to see that mud brick, so that if he sees it, he'll become it. They want him to manifest this destiny, and they curse him with this mud brick. And in addition to that, the midwives, or Nintu, she's writing something in flour. Once again, this sounds like voodoo and magical seances where there's chanting and drums are beating. This is exactly what this is. They are cursing these men. Now, mind you, this is not what actually happened. Okay, these are not the stories, the ancient Sumerian stories, nor the biblical stories, which are also ancient Sumerian. These are not. These are modified old Babylonian stories that are passed down also to New Babylon as well. These are stories that are modified later that they want to read these in man's hearing every day, and they want him to be reminded of what his destiny is, and that is to serve the God kings. The kingship came from heaven, which we're going to get into next. Who's to gain? Who has the most to gain from these modified mythologies? Why were they modified? And I know it's the kings. Okay, let's go back to the Sumerian kings list. Let's give a little background. We're going to get into the kingship. These god kings, or they so believed. Okay, Nebuchadnezzar was also deluded in believing this as well. Many of the kings believed they were god kings, and they do today. George Soros, for example, says, "I fancy the idea that I was a god." Okay, they fancy themselves, this power goes to their head, and they fancy themselves god kings, okay, which are ruled and destined for power over man, and to rule over man, and to sway the earth with their power and their money and their finances. Okay, anyways, the Sumerian kings list. This is how it starts. Kingship descended from heaven to earth. Now, I want you to know this bloodline, the Babylonian bloodline, Babylon the Great, they do believe that they descended from heaven, that their kingship came from heaven to Eridu, that they are God kings, okay? And that they are the sons of the Elohim, the Nephilim, the Anunnaki. We're going to get that. We can get that as well. They do believe that they are God kings, and their kingship descended from heaven. They are the offspring of the Elohim of heaven. Okay, the Sumerian offspring. Okay, if you look at the Sumerian kings list, it says after the kingship descended from heaven, and of course after the flood. It says, after the flood, it swept over, the kingship descended from heaven, and the kingship was in Kish. These bloodlines do believe that they are from, okay, the Elohim who descended from heaven, the Anunnaki. So this kingship, okay, descended from heaven, they need an established order of God kings on the earth. Of course, kingdoms require order, and kingdoms require workers. So these God kings gain the most from modifying these stories so that man would believe and accept his destiny as a mud worker, his destiny to dig. They want man to be brainwashed, and they want man to manifest what he sees, and they want man to manifest the mud bricks and to believe this is the destiny that the gods have created for him. These god kings have the most to gain from modifying these stories so that they can keep their workers in line, and they want man to believe that man was created to serve them for the enrichment of the gods. We believe this is why these Babylonian stories were modified from the earlier ancient Sumerian stories. So it is true that the dark turn that these stories take are definitely fraud. All right, let's go on to our last section, our bonus section, entitled Culture Contradictions. Okay, in the older Sumerian sources, when mankind was created, there's no mention of his race. Okay, 2600 BC, nor in the Bible is there mention of race. Then all of a sudden, 2,000 years after Adam, when the Akkadians, the Babylonians, and the Assyrians get their hands on the older Sumerian sources and stories and tablets, they modify the stories, and consistently we see that man was created, the man that was created that was cursed, okay, and destined to make mud bricks was definitely the black-headed people. How ironic and how convenient when they changed the destiny of man from being part of a community effort to enrich and bring abundant growth, not enrich, but bring abundant growth to the region and help be a part of a community effort and a mission to make sure everybody's fed. Now all of a sudden he becomes a slave. How convenient that his race is now black-headed people. We see the same thing in the Atrahasis, Old Babylon, and the same thing in New Babylon. We see black-headed people. So to put this in perspective on a timeline, for 2,000 years, it's just mankind. No mention of race. Then after the Tower of Babel, when the nations are dispersed, the languages are confused, and the nations are changed, all of a sudden, the sources, the Akkadian, the Babylonian, and Assyrian sources, they modify the stories, and it's no longer just mankind with no race mentioned at all. It's definitely the black-headed people that are destined to dig, whose destiny is cursed to carry and build the mud bricks that build our temples, build our pyramids and build our ziggurats, they are definitely destined to enrich and serve the gods and to toil for the gods. So our conclusion is, once again, this is another proof, the cultural contradictions, that the Babylonian, Sumerian, and the Assyrian sources are definitely fraud.
Thank you for watching I Believe X. You've now been marked in Him.